The sun was setting over a sprawling estate, its golden light cascading across manicured lawns, delicate floral arrangements, and tables dressed with fine linen. The air carried a light chill, but it was quickly combated by the warmth of glowing string lights, draped gracefully between towering oak trees. This was no ordinary evening, it was the wedding of the year, a celebration of love between two extraordinary people, Amara Jackson and David Moore. Amara, a striking black woman in her early 30s, was the epitome of elegance. Her wedding dress, a masterpiece of intricate lace and flowing fabric, seemed to catch the light with every step she took. Her calm, poised demeanor had always been her hallmark, a trait that had earned her the nickname the Ice Advocate in her legal circles. Amara wasn't just any lawyer, she was a fierce defender of civil rights, known for taking on impossible cases and winning against systems designed to oppress. Tonight, though, she wasn't the warrior battling injustice, she was a bride, radiant and hopeful, ready to start a new chapter in her life. Her groom, David Moore, stood nearby, greeting guests with his usual air of quiet authority. A prominent white judge in his late 30s, David was known for his integrity and fearless rulings against corruption and systemic abuses. His career had not been without controversy. Many in his circles found his decisions uncomfortably progressive, especially given his background of privilege. Yet David had always remained steadfast, believing that justice was not a privilege but a right for all. His relationship with Amara had, predictably, raised eyebrows, but neither of them cared. They shared a bond forged in mutual respect, admiration, and an unrelenting commitment to doing what was right. The guest list reflected the couple's diverse lives. There were fellow judges and lawyers, civil rights activists, and even community leaders from neighborhoods Amara had worked tirelessly to protect. It was a blend of power and humility, of those who had benefited from justice and those who had fought for it. The atmosphere was electric, a mix of celebration and quiet awe for the couple who had defied expectations and societal norms to stand united. As Amara moved through the crowd, graciously accepting compliments and warm wishes, there was a slight tension she couldn't quite shake. It wasn't unusual her life had been filled with moments where joy was tinged with the shadow of societal resistance. She knew too well that even on a night like this, when she should feel untouchable, there were always those who would seek to undermine her. She brushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the warmth of David's hand when he joined her, squeezing her fingers gently as if to remind her that this was their moment. The festivities carried on seamlessly, with laughter, clinking glasses, and the gentle hum of a string quartet providing the soundtrack. Guests admired the couple's choice of venue, an ancestral estate belonging to David's family, now repurposed for a celebration that symbolized progress and unity. The symbolism was not lost on Amara. She had insisted on the venue, seeing it as a reclamation of a space once reserved for exclusivity and privilege. If we're going to write a new chapter, she had told David, let's make it loud. Everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect. And then he arrived. Bradley Colson stood at the edge of the celebration, a shadow against the soft glow of the evening. His presence wasn't immediately noticed. He blended in just enough with his suit and disarming smile. But to those who recognized him, the tension was immediate. Bradley was a former police officer, a distant relative of David's, who had been invited out of familial obligation rather than genuine affection. Known for his brash demeanor and controversial past, Bradley had made a name for himself as someone who operated on the fringes of morality. He had left the force under a cloud of suspicion. Rumors of misconduct, brutality, and corruption trailed behind him like a bad smell. David had made it clear that Bradley's invitation was a formality, and he hoped the man would have the good sense to stay in the background. But Bradley wasn't the kind to stay in the background. He approached the gathering with the swagger of a man who believed he owned the room. His sharp blue eyes scanned the crowd, and when they landed on Amara, something shifted. There was a flicker of recognition, of judgment that darkened his expression. Bradley didn't like what he saw. To him, Amara didn't belong here. Her elegance, her poise, her very presence in a setting so grand felt like an affront to everything he believed in. Bradley wasn't a man of overt words. His prejudices lived in the subtle curl of his lips, the dismissive tone of his voice. And yet, tonight, emboldened by the drinks he had consumed on the way to the estate, he felt his restraint slipping. As he moved closer to the heart of the celebration, his disdain became palpable. Guests began to notice him, the way he lingered too long near conversations, the way his laughter seemed to carry an edge of mockery. It wasn't long before he made his way to David. The encounter started cordially enough. Bradley shook David's hand with a grip that felt more like a challenge than a greeting. But as the conversation progressed, his comments became sharper. "Never thought I'd see the day when Amor would tie himself to, well, you know," he said, his voice just loud enough for nearby guests to overhear. David's jaw tightened, but he held his composure, offering a polite but firm response that signaled the conversation was over. Bradley didn't stop there. He turned his attention to Amara, approaching her under the guise of congratulating the bride. But his words, though framed as compliments, were laced with venom. "Quite the necklace you've got there," he remarked, gesturing to the diamond piece David had gifted her. "It's almost too nice, if you ask me." Amara, ever the professional, responded with grace. "It was a gift from my husband-to-be," she said, her tone steady, refusing to rise to his bait. But inside, her instincts were firing. She had encountered men like Bradley before, men who wielded their prejudice like a weapon, always looking for a crack in her armor. Bradley smirked, taking a sip of his drink. "Must be nice," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "to have someone like David to lift you up." It was clear to everyone within earshot that Bradley wasn't just making small talk. His words were a provocation, a deliberate attempt to undermine Amara's confidence and make a spectacle of her. David, noticing the shift in the atmosphere, stepped in, positioning himself between Bradley and Amara. "Bradley," he said, his voice calm but firm, "perhaps you've had enough for tonight." Bradley laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Oh, come on, David, just having a little fun. No harm in asking a few questions, right?" David's expression didn't waver. "This is our wedding, Bradley. Respect that or leave." For a moment it seemed like Bradley might back down. He held David's gaze, his smirk faltering. But then, with a shrug, he stepped back, muttering something under his breath that no one could quite hear. As the evening continued, the tension lingered like a low hum in the background. Guests tried to return to their conversations and dancing, but the mood had shifted. Amara and David exchanged a glance, both silently agreeing to keep an eye on Bradley. The celebration wasn't over, but the storm was just beginning to brew. The night wore on. And despite the earlier tension caused by Bradley, the celebration slowly regained its festive rhythm. The couple had just shared their first dance, a mesmerizing waltz under the glowing lights, with the guests applauding and cheering. Amara, smiling radiantly, finally allowed herself to relax. The warmth of David's hand in hers and the admiration from the crowd reminded her why this day was so important. It wasn't just about them, it was a symbol of unity, a message to those who doubted them that love and justice could triumph. But as the music swelled and the guests joined them on the dance floor, the storm that had been brewing finally began to crack. Bradley lingered at the edge of the crowd, a drink in his hand and a scowl creeping onto his face. The more he watched Amara and David, the more his resentment festered. He couldn't shake the feeling that Amara's presence here was a mockery of everything he believed. To him, she represented the new order he despised, where people like her dared to claim spaces and successes that, in his mind, they didn't deserve. Fueled by alcohol and his own insecurities, Bradley decided it was time to act. As the dance ended and the couple moved to greet more guests, Bradley positioned himself near one of the open bars, pretending to casually sip his drink. His sharp eyes followed Amara as she gracefully navigated the crowd, her every gesture radiating confidence and poise. She didn't just belong here, she commanded the space, and that made his blood boil. When Amara stepped away from the group to retrieve a glass of champagne, Bradley saw his opportunity. He approached her with a swagger, his movements just slightly off kilter from the drinks he'd consumed. Amara noticed him coming out of the corner of her eye, her lawyer instincts immediately kicking in. She turned to face him, her expression calm but guarded. "Mrs. Almost More," Bradley began, his tone overly familiar and dripping with sarcasm. "Enjoying the party?" Amara held his gaze, refusing to let him see any hint of discomfort. "Yes, it's been a wonderful evening. Thank you for coming." Bradley took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "You know," he said, lowering his voice just enough to make the conversation feel more confrontational, "it's not every day someone like you gets to wear a necklace like that. Must cost a fortune." Amara's fingers instinctively brushed against the diamond necklace David had gifted her, a piece he had chosen not just for its beauty but for the symbolism of their journey together. She tilted her head slightly, her tone even. "It was a gift from my fiancé, a meaningful one." Bradley chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Meaningful, huh? Must be nice, having someone like David to foot the bill for your aspirations." Amara felt the heat rising in her chest, but she kept her composure. "I've earned every bit of what I have, Officer Coulson," she said, her voice steady. "I don't need anyone to foot the bill for me." Her response only seemed to irritate Bradley further. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Oh, I'm sure you've worked hard, real hard. But people like me, we see through the act. You're good at playing the part, but deep down you don't belong here. Not with him. Not in this world." Amara straightened her posture, her eyes locking onto his. "This world doesn't belong to you, Bradley, and I suggest you step back before you embarrass yourself any further." The tension was palpable now, and a few nearby guests had begun to notice the interaction. David, who had been speaking with another judge across the room, saw Bradley's looming figure and immediately excused himself, making his way toward them. But before David could reach them, Bradley made his move. With a sudden, aggressive motion, Bradley reached for Amara's necklace. His fingers yanked the delicate chain, snapping it and sending the diamond scattering onto the ground. The sharp sound of metal breaking silenced the immediate area, and all eyes turned toward the confrontation. "Let's see those receipts, sweetheart," Bradley sneered, holding up the broken necklace as if it were evidence of some crime. "Bet you can't prove you didn't steal this." Amara's breath caught in her throat, but her years of training as a lawyer wouldn't let her falter. She took a step back, keeping her voice calm but firm. "You've crossed a line, Officer Coulson. I suggest you leave this event immediately." The crowd began to murmur, shock and disbelief rippling through the room. David arrived at her side in an instant, his expression a mix of anger and restraint. He placed a protective arm around Amara, his voice cutting through the growing chaos. "Bradley, that's enough." Bradley turned to face David, his smirk widening. "Oh, come on, David. You really think this is going to last?" You and her. You've always been smarter than this. But hey, if you want to play house with a thief, that's your choice. David's jaw tightened, his calm exterior threatening to crack. You're drunk, Bradley. And you're embarrassing yourself. Put the necklace down and leave, or I'll have you removed. Bradley laughed, the sound bitter and mocking. Removed? By who? Your little army of social climbers over there. Don't forget, David, I know this system better than you do. People like me, we built it. And people like her, they're just here to tear it down. Amara stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. People like me are here to make sure people like you don't get away with this anymore. Bradley's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. He dropped the necklace onto the ground, the diamonds scattering further, and pointed a finger at Amara. You think you're untouchable. You think you've won just because you've got a fancy dress and a rich fiancé. Let me tell you something, lady. People like me don't forget. Before anyone could react, Bradley reached out and struck Amara across the face, the sharp sound of the slap reverberating through the silent crowd. Gasps echoed, and a few guests even stepped forward instinctively, their outrage evident. Amara staggered slightly but caught herself, her hand moving to her cheek as she stared at Bradley in disbelief. David's composure finally broke. He stepped between Bradley and Amara, his voice like thunder. You just assaulted my fiancée. That's not just disgraceful, it's criminal. Bradley seemed to realize he had crossed a line, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. She deserved it, he spat. People like her always do. The guests erupted into murmurs of shock and anger, some calling for security, others frozen in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Amara, despite the pain radiating from her cheek, lifted her chin and looked Bradley directly in the eye. You'll regret this, she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Not because of me, but because of what you represent. And people like us. We don't let this slide. The atmosphere had shifted entirely. The once joyous celebration now felt tense and electric, as though the air itself was holding its breath. Guests stood frozen, unsure of how to proceed after Bradley's brazen act of violence. Amara stood tall, her hand resting lightly against her cheek where the slap had landed, her expression calm yet piercing. For a moment it seemed as if time had stopped, and then the whispers began, hushed murmurs among the crowd as everyone tried to make sense of what they had just witnessed. David, standing between Amara and Bradley, radiated fury. His usually calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a steely resolve that made even the boldest observers take a step back. His voice, low and controlled, was laced with an edge sharp enough to cut through Bradley's drunken arrogance. You've just committed assault, Bradley, David said, his words deliberate. You are no longer a guest here. Leave now before you face the consequences of your actions. Bradley, still drunk and emboldened by his own toxic pride, sneered at David. Oh, is that how it's going to be? The big shot judge throwing his weight around. Don't forget, David, I know you. You think you're above everyone else, but you're just another fool who doesn't know what he's gotten himself into. David didn't flinch. Instead, he straightened his posture, his height and presence suddenly making Bradley seem smaller despite his swagger. I don't care what you think you know, Bradley. This isn't about me. This is about you and the fact that you've just proven in front of dozens of witnesses exactly what kind of man you are. Bradley laughed bitterly, taking an unsteady step forward. You think I care about these people? He waved a hand dismissively at the crowd, his voice growing louder with each word. They're all just sheep, following you and your little progressive project. Marrying her, he jabbed a finger in Amara's direction, his voice dripping with disdain. Doesn't make you a hero, David. It makes you a joke. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, some guests inching closer, as if ready to intervene. Among them were a few of David's colleagues, judges, lawyers, and community leaders, who looked on with a mix of horror and disbelief. One of them, a distinguished older judge named Eleanor Hart, stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. "That's enough," Judge Hart said, her tone commanding. "Officer Coulson, you are not only out of line, but you are in violation of the law. If you don't leave this property immediately, I will ensure that you are arrested on the spot." Bradley turned to her, his face twisting with contempt. "Oh, great, another self-righteous lecture from the ivory tower. You people think you're so much better than everyone else. But you don't know what it's like out there, in the real world. You don't know what it's like to do what we do." Judge Hart's expression didn't waver. "What you do is not justice, Bradley. What you've done tonight is assault, intimidation, and abuse, and it will not be tolerated." Before Bradley could respond, Amara stepped forward, her voice calm but resonant. "You're done, Bradley. Not just here, but everywhere. Your behavior tonight isn't just criminal, it's a testament to everything wrong with the system you claim to uphold." Bradley's smirk faltered for the first time, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty, but it was fleeting. He puffed out his chest, taking another defiant step forward. "You don't scare me, lady," he spat. "People like you thinking you can come into our world and take what doesn't belong to you, you don't last. You'll see." Amara didn't flinch. Instead, she crossed her arms, her eyes locking onto Bradley's with a quiet, unshakable resolve. "You're right about one thing, Bradley," she said. "People like me don't last, we thrive. And people like you self-destruct." The crowd erupted into whispers again, some murmurs of approval, others of shock at Amara's boldness. Bradley seemed momentarily stunned, unsure of how to respond. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, his voice growing louder and more erratic. "You think you're better than me?" he shouted, pointing an accusing finger at Amara. "You're just a parasite, feeding off the system people like me built. Without us, you're nothing. Nothing." "Hem." David stepped forward, his voice like thunder. "That's enough." His command silenced the crowd, and even Bradley stopped mid-rant. David's eyes burned with a controlled fury as he spoke. "You're no longer welcome here, Bradley. You've humiliated yourself. And if you take one more step out of line, I will personally ensure that you face the full extent of the law." Bradley stared at David, his bravado finally beginning to crack. For the first time, he seemed to realize the gravity of the situation, the witnesses, the social and professional weight of the people around him, and the very real consequences he could face. But his pride wouldn't let him retreat entirely. Instead, he threw up his hands in mock surrender, taking a step back. "Fine," he said, his tone laced with bitterness. "I'll leave. But don't think this is over. You'll see. You'll all see." He turned and began to stagger toward the exit, the crowd parting to let him pass. For a moment it seemed as though the ordeal was over, but as Bradley reached the edge of the property, he stopped, turning back to face the gathering one last time. "You think you've won tonight?" he called out, his voice echoing through the tense silence. "But people like me, we don't go down that easy. And people like you," his gaze landed squarely on Amara, "you always slip up eventually." With that, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving a trail of unease in his wake. The guests began to murmur again, some trying to return to their conversations, others exchanging worried glances, but the mood had shifted irrevocably. The night that had started as a celebration of love and unity had turned into something much darker, a stark reminder of the battles still left to fight. David turned to Amara, his hand gently brushing against her cheek where the slap had landed. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softening. Amara nodded, though her eyes were still locked on the direction Bradley had gone. "I'm fine," she said. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." David's jaw tightened. "I know. And we'll handle it. Together." Judge Hart stepped forward, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "He's not going to let this go quietly," she said. "People like him rarely do." Amara turned to her, her voice steady. "Neither will we." The weight of her words hung in the air, resonating with everyone who heard them. Amara wasn't just speaking for herself, she was speaking for everyone who had ever faced someone like Bradley, everyone who had been told they didn't belong, everyone who had been made to feel small. And in that moment, she wasn't just a bride or a lawyer. She was a symbol of resistance, of strength, and of the unrelenting pursuit of justice. As the night wore on, the guests slowly began to recover from the shock of the confrontation. The music resumed, though it was quieter now, and the laughter was more subdued. But beneath the surface, a new energy was building, a determination to ensure that Bradley's actions would not go unanswered. Amara and David stood side by side, their hands intertwined, as they prepared for what was to come. The fight wasn't over, but they were ready. The estate had returned to a deceptive calm, with the band quietly playing in the background and waitstaff discreetly tidying up shattered glasses and upturned chairs. Yet the tension lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Bradley Colson had left, but his presence remained, casting a shadow over what was supposed to be the happiest night of Amara and David's lives. Amara stood near the head table, her hand resting lightly on the back of a chair for balance. Though outwardly calm, her mind raced. The sting of Bradley's slap had long faded, replaced by a sharper pain, the realization that men like him didn't act alone. They were emboldened by systems, by silence, by the unspoken permission of others like them. She glanced around the crowd. The guests, who had been so lively and jubilant earlier, now wore expressions of unease. Some avoided her gaze entirely, their discomfort palpable. David approached her, his voice low. "You should sit for a moment, Amara. Take a breath." She shook her head. "I'm fine, David. We can't let him take this night from us." He reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "This is our night, but you're more important than anything else. Let me handle this." Amara looked up at him, her resolve unshaken. "No," she said softly but firmly. "I've spent my life handling men like Bradley. Tonight won't be any different." Before David could respond, Judge Eleanor Hart joined them, her brow furrowed. "David, Amara," she began, her voice edged with concern, "we have a problem." David's shoulders tensed. "What kind of problem?" Judge Hart glanced around, lowering her voice further. Bradley didn't leave quietly. He was stopped at the gate by the security team. They said he was muttering about having unfinished business here and that he'd be back. "I've already alerted the authorities, but we can't take this lightly." Amara exhaled, her eyes narrowing. "He's not just drunk. He's dangerous. Men like him, with nothing left to lose, they don't stop until someone makes them." David nodded, his jaw tightening. "Did security let him go?" "They escorted him off the property," Hart confirmed. "But that doesn't mean he won't try to come back." Amara straightened, her mind already working through the possibilities. "We need to contain this. If Bradley comes back, we can't afford for this to escalate further. Not here, not tonight." David's voice hardened. "If he shows up again, we'll ensure he doesn't walk away this time. Legally." Amara's lips tightened into a thin line. "David, I don't think you understand. This isn't just about Bradley. Men like him are symptoms, not the disease. He's part of something bigger, a culture that allows people like him to thrive. David's expression softened, his eyes searching hers. "I know, Amara. Believe me, I know. But tonight, we focus on what's in front of us. We'll deal with the bigger picture tomorrow." Meanwhile, Bradley's descent. Across town, Bradley sat slumped in his car, parked on the side of a darkened road. The streetlights above cast harsh shadows across his face, accentuating the lines of rage and frustration etched into his features. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He replayed the night's events in his head, each moment feeding the fire in his chest. The way David had dismissed him. The way Amara had looked at him, unafraid and unyielding. The way the crowd had judged him, their eyes full of disdain. "They think they're better than me," he muttered to himself, his voice low and venomous. "All of them. But they don't know who they're dealing with." Bradley reached for the glove compartment, pulling out a small, worn notebook. Flipping through its pages, he scanned names, dates, and notes scrawled in a messy hand. This wasn't just any notebook, it was his ledger, a record of every favor, every deal, every dirty secret he had come across during his time on the force. It was his insurance policy, a lifeline he had always intended to use if things went south. He stopped on a page marked with David's name. A twisted smile crept across his face as he traced the writing with his finger. "You're not so clean, Judge Moore," he whispered. "Let's see how long you stay on your high horse when the world knows your secrets." Bradley slammed the notebook shut and started the car, his mind racing. He had a plan now, and it didn't just involve humiliating David and Amara. It involved destroying them. The tipping point at the wedding. Back at the estate, the mood among the guests had grown restless. Conversations were hushed, laughter subdued. Amara noticed the shift and knew that Bradley's outburst had left more than just a mark on her cheek. It had shaken the very foundation of the event. She decided to address it head-on. Amara stepped onto the small stage at the center of the reception area, tapping the microphone gently to draw attention. The hum of conversation quieted, and all eyes turned to her. She stood tall, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady and clear, "tonight is a celebration of love, of unity and of progress. But it would be dishonest of me to stand here and pretend that tonight hasn't also been a reminder of the challenges we still face." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, but Amara continued undeterred. "Earlier this evening, someone tried to undermine what this night stands for. He tried to make me feel small, to make us feel small. But let me be clear, no one, not Bradley Coulson, not anyone has the power to take away what we've built here." The murmurs grew quieter, replaced by nods and murmurs of agreement. David watched her from the edge of the stage, his heart swelling with pride. Amara's voice grew stronger. "Men like him thrive on silence. They rely on us to look the other way, to dismiss their actions as the drunken rantings of a bitter man. But silence is complicity, and I refuse to be complicit." Applause erupted, hesitant at first but quickly growing louder. Amara allowed a small smile to cross her lips before continuing. "This is not just a wedding. This is a declaration. A declaration that love is stronger than hate, that unity is stronger than division, and that justice will always prevail. So tonight we celebrate, not just us, but the future we are building together." The crowd rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. The tension that had hung over the evening seemed to dissipate, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. Amara stepped down from the stage, returning to David's side as the band struck up a lively tune. "You never cease to amaze me," David said, his voice filled with admiration. Amara smiled up at him. "I had a good teacher, But even as the music swelled and the guests returned to the dance floor, a shadow loomed in the back of her mind. She knew Bradley wasn't finished, and this time she would be ready. Bradley's next move. As the wedding regained its celebratory air, Bradley parked his car outside a dimly lit bar. He had made a call on his way there, and now he waited, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. A few minutes later, another car pulled up beside him, and a man stepped out tall, broad-shouldered, with an air of menace that was impossible to ignore. Bradley, the man, greeted him, his voice low and gravelly. "This better be worth my time." Bradley grinned, his confidence returning. "Oh, it will be. I've got a little project for you. A couple of people who need to be reminded of their place." The man raised an eyebrow. "And what's in it for me?" Bradley reached for his notebook, flipping to a specific page. He tapped it twice before handing it over. "Information. The kind that could make you very rich or very dangerous." The man scanned the page, his expression unreadable. After a moment he nodded. "I'll see what I can do." Bradley leaned back in his seat, his grin widening. "Good. Let's show them what happens when you mess with the wrong people." The night seemed to settle back into a fragile rhythm. The band played softer, slower melodies, as if trying to lull the tension away. Guests returned to their conversations, but the shadow of Bradley's actions loomed over the event. Amara stood at the edge of the reception area, gazing across the crowd with an air of detachment. Though her outward poise remained unshaken, inside her thoughts churned like a storm. Bradley's slap wasn't just an act of personal disrespect, it was a direct attack on everything she had worked for, everything she believed in. And it wasn't over. Men like Bradley didn't walk away quietly. David approached her, his expression a mixture of concern and determination. He placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Amara, let's take a moment. Just you and me. You've already said everything that needed to be said." Amara shook her head gently, keeping her voice low but firm. "David, this isn't over. You know that as well as I do. Bradley's not the kind of man who knows when to stop, and we can't ignore what he's done, what he represents." Before David could respond, Judge Eleanor Hart appeared beside them, her face pale and her lips pressed into a thin line. She leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have a problem. Security just reported that Bradley's car was spotted circling the estate. They've been monitoring him, but it's clear he hasn't left the area." David's hand dropped from Amara's arm, his expression darkening. "What the hell is he doing now?" "He's dangerous," Amara interjected. "And he's not just drunk. He's angry, he's vindictive, and he's desperate. We can't treat this like he's just another belligerent guest." Hart nodded in agreement. "I've already alerted the authorities, but given his history, we can't afford to wait for them to handle this. He's too volatile." David straightened, his jaw tightening. "If Bradley comes back onto this property, I want him detained immediately. Whatever happens, we'll deal with him on our terms, not his." Amara glanced at the worried faces around her. "We need to prepare for more than just him showing up again. Men like Bradley don't act alone. He may have already called for reinforcements, or worse, decided to escalate things further. We can't afford to assume this is just about his ego." David met her gaze, the unspoken understanding between them deep and steady. "Then we prepare for the worst." Meanwhile, just outside the estate, Bradley's car idled in the shadows. He sat hunched over the steering wheel, his breath fogging up the glass as his anger simmered into something colder and more calculating. His ledger lay open on the passenger seat, its pages a testament to years of corruption, secrets, and leverage. The scrawled notes and names were his insurance policy, the thing that had kept him untouchable for so long. Tonight, though, it was something more, a weapon. He flipped to the page marked More, David, his finger tracing the lines of damning information. A secret from years ago, buried under layers of bureaucracy and sealed records, sat waiting to be unearthed. Bradley grinned, his lips curling into a twisted sneer. "You think you're so clean," he muttered to himself. "Let's see how your perfect little world holds up when the truth comes out." He reached for his phone, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. After a few rings, a gravelly voice answered. "Bradley. Long time. What do you want?" Bradley's grin widened. "I've got a little job for you. A message that needs delivering. Tonight." Back at the estate, the fragile peace began to fray once more. A low hum of unease rippled through the crowd as whispers spread of Bradley's lingering presence. Amara and David moved to the center of the reception area, instinctively taking charge. Amara's voice carried over the murmurs, calm but commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, we want to assure you that everything is under control. There's no reason to be alarmed." David added, "Security is handling the situation, and the authorities are on their way. In the meantime, let's continue to celebrate what this night is really about." Most of the guests nodded, some even raising their glasses in a show of support. But not everyone was reassured. Amara noticed a few guests slipping away toward their cars, their unease too great to ignore. She couldn't blame them. The weight of the evening's events hung heavy in the air, and the threat of Bradley's return was impossible to ignore. Judge Hart pulled Amara aside, her voice low and urgent. "There's more." One of the security guards reported seeing Bradley meet with someone near the back gate, a man we couldn't identify. They handed something off, and then the man left on foot. Whatever it was, Bradley's escalating. Amara's mind raced, piecing together the implications. He's not just trying to disrupt the wedding anymore. He's planning something bigger. David joined them, his expression grim. "Then we need to act now. Hart, get security to tighten the perimeter. If anyone sees Bradley, they're to detain him immediately." Amara shook her head. "Detaining him won't stop this. He's already moved past being a drunk, belligerent guest. He's trying to destroy us publicly, professionally, and personally. And if we don't stop him tonight, he'll come back stronger." David placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady. "Then we stop him. Together." An hour later, the celebration was abruptly interrupted by a loud commotion near the estate's entrance. Guests turned toward the sound, their conversations halting mid-sentence. Amara and David moved quickly toward the source, their hearts pounding with anticipation. They found Bradley standing in the middle of the driveway, flanked by two men who looked every bit as rough and dangerous as he did. One of them held a camera, the lens pointed directly at the crowd. The other carried a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his hand hovering near its zipper. Bradley spread his arms wide, his grin as menacing as it was unhinged. Well, he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Looks like the party's still going. Mind if we join?" David stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "Bradley, this ends now. Leave before you do something you can't come back from." Bradley laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "Oh, I'm way past the point of no return, David. But thanks for the concern. Really warms the heart." Amara joined David, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Whatever you think you're going to accomplish tonight, it won't work. You're outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and out of your depth." Bradley's grin widened. "That's where you're wrong, sweetheart. See, I've got something you don't. Leverage." He motioned to the man with the duffel bag, who unzipped it to reveal a stack of documents and a laptop. The man with the camera stepped closer, the lens focusing on Amara and David. Bradley gestured grandly. This here. This is my insurance policy. Secrets, scandals, everything your perfect little world doesn't want anyone to know. And tonight, it's going public." The crowd gasped, a wave of panic rippling through the guests. Amara felt her stomach tighten, but she refused to let Bradley see her fear. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. "You're bluffing, and even if you're not, your actions tonight have already sealed your fate. Whatever you think you've got, it won't save you." Bradley's grin faltered for a fraction of a second before returning full force. "We'll see about that." At that moment, the sound of sirens pierced the night air, growing louder with each passing second. Bradley's expression twisted into something between rage and desperation as flashing blue lights illuminated the driveway. Uniformed officers poured out of their vehicles, weapons drawn, and commands shouted. "Bradley Colson," one of the officers barked, "put your hands where we can see them." For the first time, Bradley hesitated. His bravado cracked, replaced by a flicker of fear. But instead of complying, he turned back to Amara and David, his eyes blazing. "This isn't over," he snarled. "You'll regret this. Both of you." Before he could act, the officers closed in, forcing him to the ground and securing his hands behind his back. His accomplices surrendered without a fight, their plans unraveling in an instant. Amara and David stood side by side, watching as Bradley was led away. The night had taken its toll, but as they exchanged a glance, a shared understanding passed between them. This wasn't the end, but they were ready for whatever came next. The flashing blue and red lights bathed the estate in a surreal glow, casting long, distorted shadows across the once celebratory grounds. Guests huddled in tense clusters, their murmurs a low hum of uncertainty and shock. The air was heavy with the aftermath of Bradley's arrest, but for Amara and David, the battle was far from over. Amara stood tall near the center of the commotion, her gaze sharp and unwavering as she watched the officers secure Bradley's accomplices and collect evidence from the duffel bag and laptop he had brought. The weight of what had just unfolded pressed on her chest, but she wouldn't let it crush her. Not now. David, standing close by, was speaking with Judge Eleanor Hart and one of the senior officers on the scene. His voice was calm but firm, his presence steadying amidst the chaos. Despite his composed demeanor, Amara could see the tension in his jaw, the controlled fire in his eyes. This wasn't just about Bradley anymore, it never had been. It was about something far bigger, and they both knew it. One of the officers approached Amara, his expression a mix of respect and professionalism. "Evs Jackson," he began, his voice low, "we've secured the suspects, but there's something you need to see." Amara nodded, her pulse quickening. She followed the officer toward the makeshift evidence table set up near the edge of the driveway. On the table sat the open laptop, its screen glowing faintly in the night. Next to it was a stack of documents, each marked with red tabs and handwritten notes. Amara scanned the top page, her eyes narrowing as she processed the words. It was worse than she had imagined. The documents weren't just random pieces of information, they were detailed records of corruption, incriminating evidence against police officers, judges, and city officials. Bradley had been keeping tabs on everyone, using his position to collect dirt and wield it like a weapon. But buried within the pages was something else, something personal. Amara's name, David's name. The accusations were baseless, but the intent was clear. Bradley had been planning to destroy their reputations, to use lies and half-truths to turn their lives into a public spectacle. David appeared at her side, his gaze falling on the documents. His face hardened as he read the lines, his fists clenching at his sides. "He was going to smear us," he said, his voice low and steady, though the anger beneath it was unmistakable. He wasn't just trying to ruin the wedding, he wanted to ruin everything. Amara nodded, her mind racing. This isn't just Bradley acting out of spite. This is calculated. He had help. Someone fed him these ideas, these connections. He's part of something larger. David placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. We'll deal with it, together. Before she could respond, an officer approached with a grim expression. Judge Moore, Miss Jackson, he said. Bradley's asking to speak with you. He's refusing to talk to anyone else. David's brow furrowed. And what does he want to say? The officer shrugged slightly. He hasn't said, but he's demanding both of you come down to the station. Amara glanced at David, her instincts screaming against the idea of giving Bradley more of their time. But another part of her, the part that had spent her life uncovering hidden truths and dismantling injustice, knew this was an opportunity. Bradley was cornered, and cornered men often made mistakes. We'll go, Amara said firmly. David opened his mouth to protest, but she cut him off with a look. This might be our only chance to get ahead of whatever he's planning. David sighed but nodded. Fine, but we're going on our terms. An hour later, Amara and David arrived at the precinct. The fluorescent lights of the holding area cast a harsh, sterile glow over the scene. Bradley sat behind a metal table in a small interrogation room, his wrists cuffed and his face pale but defiant. The smirk he wore earlier was gone, replaced by a sneer of barely concealed contempt. As Amara and David entered, Bradley's eyes lit up with a dangerous glint. Ah, the happy couple, he drawled. Here to gloat, or to beg. Amara crossed her arms, her expression icy. We're here because you asked for us. If you've got something to say, make it quick. We're not interested in wasting time on your games. Bradley leaned back in his chair, the cuffs clinking against the metal. Games. Is that what you think this is? He laughed bitterly. You two are so predictable. Always so damn righteous, thinking you can just steamroll over anyone who doesn't fit into your perfect little world. David's voice was calm but firm. If you've got something to say it. Otherwise, enjoy your cell. Bradley's sneer deepened. Oh, I'll talk. But only because I want you to hear it from me. See, you think you've won. You think locking me up means it's over. But it's not. I'm just the beginning. Amara's gaze sharpened. The beginning of what? Bradley leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You've made enemies, Amara. Both of you. Powerful ones. And they're not going to stop just because I'm out of the picture. I'm just the one dumb enough to act first. Amara's stomach tightened, but she refused to show any reaction. Who are they? Names. Bradley laughed again, the sound harsh and empty. You really think I'm going to hand it all over to you? No, sweetheart. You'll have to figure that out on your own. But I'll give you this, they're watching. They've been watching for a long time. And they're not happy about what you're doing, who you're becoming. David stepped closer, his voice steady. You're bluffing. You're trying to scare us into making a mistake. But it won't work. Bradley's smirk returned, faint but visible. Believe what you want, Judge. But remember this, even the strongest towers fall when the foundation is cracked. And your foundation? It's not as solid as you think. Amara and David exchanged a glance, the weight of Bradley's words settling heavily between them. Whatever the truth behind his threats, one thing was clear. This wasn't the end of their fight. It was only the beginning. As they left the precinct, the chill of the night air hit them like a slap. Amara turned to David, her voice quiet but resolute. He's lying about some of it, but not all of it. We need to be ready. David nodded, his expression grave. We will be, no matter what it takes. Together they walked into the night, the glow of the city lights casting long shadows ahead of them. The road would be hard, the fight relentless, but they were ready. For themselves, for each other, and for the truth. The estate was quiet now, the last of the guests having departed hours earlier. Only the soft hum of crickets filled the still air, a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted earlier in the evening. Amara and David sat side by side on the terrace, the remnants of their wedding attire now slightly disheveled. The diamond necklace, broken during Bradley's earlier assault, lay repaired on the table between them, a silent symbol of their resilience. The events of the day weighed heavily on them both. Bradley's threats at the precinct replayed in Amara's mind, his words laced with venom and a chilling certainty that refused to be dismissed. He wasn't bluffing, at least not entirely. She had seen men like him before, men who thrived on wielding power in the shadows, protected by the systems they exploited. But Bradley wasn't just one man. He was a symptom of something larger, and the fight against him was only the beginning. David broke the silence, his voice soft but steady. He's right about one thing. There are more of them. People who don't want to see us succeed. People who think we don't belong. Amara nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the faintest hint of dawn was beginning to break. That's why we don't stop. Not now. Not ever. David leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. This isn't just about us anymore. Bradley's ledger, those names, those connections, it's a roadmap. It's dangerous, but it's also an opportunity. Amara turned to him, her brow furrowed. If we use it, we're painting targets on our backs. You know that, right? David's eyes met hers, a spark of determination in his gaze. We've had targets on our backs since the day we decided to fight for what's right. This doesn't change that. If anything, it makes it clearer. Amara let his words settle in the space between them. He was right, of course. They had always known this journey would be perilous, but the stakes had never been higher. Bradley's arrest was just the first crack in a dam holding back years of corruption, hatred, and unchecked power. What lay beyond that crack was both daunting and inevitable. In the following days, the aftermath of the wedding and Bradley's arrest began to ripple outward. News of the incident spread quickly, but without sensationalized headlines or viral videos, just whispers in powerful circles about a man who had gone too far and the couple who had stood against him. The narrative wasn't about the slap or the disruption. It was about what it represented, a clash between progress and resistance, between justice and the fear of losing power. Amara and David worked tirelessly, often late into the night, poring over the documents retrieved from Bradley's duffel bag. The ledger was a labyrinth of connections, each name and date linked to a web of corruption that reached farther than they had imagined. Some names were expected officers known for their misconduct, officials with reputations for shady dealings, but others were shocking, including figures Amara and David had once considered allies. "We have to tread carefully," Amara said one evening, her eyes scanning a particularly damning page. "If we go public with this too quickly, they'll shut it down before we even get started." David nodded, his expression grim. "And if we wait too long, they'll bury it deeper. We need a strategy, something precise, undeniable." Judge Eleanor Hart became their confidante, her experience and connections proving invaluable. She agreed to help them build a case, one that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Together, they identified key targets, individuals whose exposure would not only dismantle parts of the system, but also send a message to those who thought they were untouchable. Months passed, and the quiet resolve of their efforts began to bear fruit. Strategic leaks of specific evidence from Bradley's ledger made their way to trusted journalists, sparking investigations that led to the suspension of multiple officers and officials. One of the biggest shocks came when a well-known city councilman was forced to resign after being directly linked to a bribery scheme Bradley had facilitated years earlier. The cracks in the dam were widening. and the waters of truth were beginning to surge through. But the fight was not without its costs. Amara and David faced relentless scrutiny from those who feared their actions. Anonymous threats arrived by mail and phone, warning them to back down. David's reputation as a judge was attacked, with whispers that he was too biased to serve fairly. Amara's past cases were dredged up, with critics attempting to paint her as a radical rather than an advocate. Each new challenge tested their resolve, but neither wavered. One night, as they sat in their living room, surrounded by stacks of evidence, David looked up from his notes and caught Amara's eye. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Taking all of this on?" Amara smiled faintly, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "Every time I think about what it would mean to walk away, I think about people like Bradley. I think about the families who don't get justice because the system is rigged against them. And I remember why we're here." David nodded, his own resolve solidifying once more. "Then we keep going." The final blow to Bradley's network came nearly a year after the wedding. A grand jury indictment named several high-ranking officials in a sweeping corruption case that rocked the city to its core. The evidence Amara and David had painstakingly gathered played a pivotal role, though they remained largely in the background, letting the system work as it should. It was a victory not just for them but for everyone who had been waiting for accountability. Bradley himself, now serving time for assault and multiple charges of misconduct, remained defiant. From his prison cell, he continued to spew threats and declarations of revenge, but his words carried little weight. The system that had once protected him was crumbling, and he was powerless to stop it. On the anniversary of their wedding, Amara and David returned to the estate. The grounds had been restored to their former beauty, the scars of that fateful night now hidden beneath fresh blooms and manicured lawns. As they walked hand in hand through the garden, the memories of that evening resurfaced not as a source of pain, but as a reminder of their strength. Standing beneath the same string lights where they had exchanged their first dance, David pulled Amara close. "We've come a long way," he said softly. Amara smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "And we're just getting started." As the sun set behind them, casting the estate in a golden glow, they stood together, partners in love, in justice, and in the unyielding fight for a better future.